Welcome everyone to my AGU talk and thank you for tuning in. I'd like to also thank the organizers for putting this session together. In this talk, I would like to explore the co-evolution of silicate, carbonate, and sulfide weathering across erosion rate gradients. So essentially, I am interested in talking about the link between weathering rate and erosion rate and how this link influences the balance between CO2 release and CO2 drawdown. Chemical weathering is one of the cornerstones of the carbon cycle. CO2 gets degassed from the mantle on land and in the ocean, and the CO2 builds up in the atmosphere. For Earth climate to remain stable, natural processes have to remove and sequester the CO2. And one of the most important processes by which this removal occurs is the weathering of silicate minerals. What happens is that when CO2 dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid, and this acid can dissolve silicate minerals. This produces solutes that can get washed into rivers and eventually the ocean and drive the precipitation of calcium carbonate minerals. And these calcium carbonate minerals lock up half of the CO2 that was initially dissolved in the water. So in this way, silicate weathering constitutes a long-term carbon sink. Weathering occurs when acidic fluids interact with minerals in the subsurface, dissolve parts of the minerals, and transport solutes into rivers and eventually the ocean. And three of the main controls on weathering fluxes are the availability of acidic fluids, the runoff, the temperature, and then the availability of fresh surfaces to weather. And this last control is at the origin of the idea that there is a link between chemical weathering rates and erosion rates, because erosion is one of the main processes by which fresh surfaces are transported to Earth's surface and become exposed to the atmosphere and to fluids and can weather. Now, if this is true, then the cooling that we observe through the Cenozoic could be in part driven by the growth of mountain ranges such as the Alps or the Himalaya that would have boosted weathering rates globally. However, as erosion rates increase further, weathering rates may become limited and stop increasing with further erosion. And I want to refer to three main limits here: the supply, the kinetic, and the equilibrium limit. The supply limit is this idea that we've just been talking about, where weathering is limited by the availability of fresh mineral surfaces. So it should scale with the rate at which minerals are supplied to our surfaces and therefore with erosion rate. Now, as erosion and the supply of fresh minerals increases further, the kinetics of weathering may not be able to keep up with the supply of minerals. And therefore, even if more minerals are supplied, weathering rates cannot increase. And that would be the kinetic limit. A related similar limit is the equilibrium limit, where the idea is that if there's not enough acidic fluids that are supplied and that can weather all the fresh minerals that are exposed at our surface, weathering rates may also become insensitive to erosion rates and more sensitive to the supply of acid. So that would be what I call here the equilibrium limit. For this talk, the leading questions are: what is the impact of the supply of fresh surfaces on chemical weathering rates? And specifically, how do the limits of chemical weathering evolve across erosion rate gradients? And I would like to look at that question separately for silicate, carbonate, and sulfide weathering and explore how these phases co-evolve across this erosion rate gradients. The reason why this is important is that these phases impact the carbon cycle differently. So how does this work? So far, I've only talked about silicate weathering, which presents a long-term carbon sink when it is weathered with carbonic acid. There are also other minerals that can weather, and among them, most importantly, carbonates and sulfides. Carbonates are carbon neutral if they are weathered with carbonic acid on timescales longer than about 10,000 years. Sulfides produce sulfuric acid, and this sulfuric acid can consume some of the alkalinity that is produced by carbonate and silicate weathering. So simply put, we could say that weathering of silicates with sulfuric acid becomes carbon neutral, weathering of carbonates becomes a carbon source. And this is then relevant for the carbon cycle. There are a number of existing studies that look at the link between weathering and denudation, or physical erosion. Most prominently, the global compilation of major river chemistry from Gayadeh 1999, and a compilation of more local streams across the globe from West 2005. Both these studies look at silicate weathering, but there are also a number of studies that look at sulfuric acid weathering of carbonates across the globe, and all of these have been most recently summarized by Hilton and West 2020. Now, there are a couple of challenges in using these data sets with regards to the questions that we've posed. First, many of these data are global in extent and range across lithologic, climatic, and tectonic boundary conditions. There is no single local study that looks at the coevolution of silicate, carbonate, and sulfide weathering across a single erosion rate gradient. The second challenge is that these studies look at weathering fluxes, and where the weathering flux is the product of the weathering rate and or the concentration of the solutes in the water and the amount of water, so the runoff. This is depicted here. Now, this is very useful when we are interested in global budgets of weathering and budgets of the carbon cycle. However, isolating the role of mineral supply to the weathering zone from the runoff component and basically looking at the processes that drive these relationship between weathering and erosion becomes complex. To illustrate this, here I'm plotting weathering fluxes against erosion rates for 3 different data sets, Gayadeh 1999, West 2005, and then a local data set of New Zealand stream chemistry from Jacobson 2003. And you can see that in all these data sets, the silicate weathering fluxes generally increase with erosion rates. Now here I'm plotting runoff across the same erosion rate gradient, and you can see that a large part of the variation in weathering flux can be explained by variations in runoff. This doesn't matter when we're thinking about weathering budgets, but it makes it tricky to isolate the control of the additional or the increasing supply of fresh mineral surfaces to the weathering zone, because that requires some assumptions on the impact that the runoff has on stream chemistry, on how it dilutes the stream chemistry. So for the purposes of this talk, I would like to turn to a local study area with small variations in runoff and large variations of erosion rate. And for this, I turn to the southern tip of Taiwan, which presents this very nice gradient in relief and topography from south to north. And this is reflected in a gradient in erosion rates. You can see this very nicely with the increased landslide activity to the north. And there's a number of data sets that both thermochronology and cosmogenic nuclides that document an erosion rate gradient. There are even more cosmogenic nuclide data now available. Conversely, there's only a minor runoff gradient of less than 2 to 3-fold. There is also a minor lithologic gradient. Most of the study area lies within the stark green unit, which are Cenozoic shales and argillites of the slate belt. These overlie more high-grade metapelites of the Tanano complex. And in the south, we have the exposure of turbidite sequences from the Miocene in this Mutan formation, and these units are sandier than the shales in the north here. So this is worth keeping in mind. Across this erosion rate gradient here, we sampled waters from major rivers and tributaries. We measured the major chemistry, the major cations and anions in these waters, and we partitioned the contributions to the chemistry from silicates, carbonates, cyclic, hot spring, and sulfide sources. And then we inferred erosion rates from a local calibration between the steepness in the river catchments and cosmogenic nuclide data. I'm jumping right to the results here. And in all the plots moving forward, I am plotting the catchment average steepness index on the lower x-axis, the erosion rates that are inferred from the link between steepness and cosmogenically derived erosion on the upper x-axis, and then concentrations on the y. So here I am plotting the cations that have been associated with silicates in red, the cations from carbonates in blue, and the sulfides from sulfide in yellow. And at first glance, you can already see that these phases all evolve quite differently across this erosion rate gradient. So here I'm plotting only the sulfides now, and we can see that sulfate concentrations increase across this erosion rate gradient in accordance with what other people have proposed. Note two things: that first, the symbols of the lithologies mark the different lithologic units that they're coming from, and that in all the plots, I plot a number of data points darker, and those are the ones that are sort of the outliers in the sulfate trend. So we interpret this data as a supply limit to sulfide oxidation, which is limited by the supply of sulfide, so pyrite, for example. The carbonate weathering rates also appear to increase across this erosion rate gradient. So we might interpret this also as a supply limit. However, if we look at the saturation index of these waters with respect to calcite, we notice that many of these rivers, or most of these rivers, are oversaturated in calcium carbonate, and that waters here are limited by the amount of acid that is available. So we interpret this as an equilibrium limit to carbonate weathering, or an acid limit to carbonate weathering. Now we have just seen that the availability of sulfuric acid increases across this erosion rate gradient. And indeed, there seems to be quite a good correlation between cations from carbonate weathering and the sulfate concentration. We can make a more involved arguments calculating the pH change that we expect from this additional sulfuric acid and the pH change that we would expect to need in order to explain this increase with carbonate weathering. But for this talk, suffice to say that we interpret this increase in carbonate weathering to be driven, at least in parts, by the increased availability of sulfuric acid. Now, in contrast to carbonate weathering, silicate weathering rates do not seem to be modulated by the sulfate concentrations. Also don't seem to be modulated by erosion rates. So this looks very much like a kinetic limit to silicate weathering that seems to span across the entire erosion rate gradient that we sample here. Overall, there doesn't appear to be a universal pattern in which these phases vary with erosion rates. In particular, here sulfides are supply limited, carbonates equilibrium limited, and silicates kinetically limited across basically the entire sampled erosion rate gradient. Furthermore, there appear to be interactions between phases. In particular, the increase in carbonate weathering rates, despite the equilibrium limit of carbonate weathering, seems to be, at least in part, driven by the supply limitation of sulfide oxidation and sulfuric acid availability. Whereas on the other hand, silicate weathering rates, or silicate weathering kinetics, appear mostly untouched by this increase in acid availability, which then leads to the difference in pattern between carbonate and silicate weathering. The overall result is that both the fraction of carbonate weathering in blue and the fraction of sulfuric acid weathering in yellow increase across this erosion rate gradient. As a reminder, the impact of sulfuric acid is to consume alkalinity and to shift the carbon balance of these weathering reactions. So here, I am plotting now the balance of CO2 drawdown and CO2 release across this erosion rate gradient, and we find that the increasing importance of carbonate and sulfuric acid weathering, or sulfide weathering, shifts the system from a net CO2 sink to a net CO2 source at erosion rates between 0.1 and maybe 0.5 millimeters per year. Now, this is obviously specific to the lithologies in Taiwan, but these shale-rich metasediments that are exposed there are typical of many young mountain ranges. That means that increases in erosion rates in these kind of rocks and the associated changes in weathering rates cannot well explain the drawdown of CO2 through the Cenozoic. So we need to explore different explanations, such as weathering in floodplains, weathering of different lithologies, or the whole organic carbon cycle. So with this, I would like to thank you all for listening, and thanks to all the folks that helped with the project.